Manchester.
Yep.
First met in Barnsley, digital media centre a long time ago now, wasn't it? A year ago.
We did.
Matt remembered the date. Don't know where he's gone. Oh, he's here.
That's where we met Matt as well.
Yeah.
It all came
Still
together.
material now.
Hi everybody, I'm Julian Tait. I'm the CEO of Open Data Manchester, but I'm one of the initiators, along with Dave, with regards to Things Manchester, and I suppose part of the Things North community. So I just want to tell you a little about what we do. Got to do the optics. So basically, it's a community interest company that was established in 2010, and what we're interested in with regards to Things Network, as far as Open Data Manchester is concerned, is the idea that it's building open infrastructure or commons-based infrastructure. So with Open Data Manchester, we talk about organisations releasing data for the benefit of the citizenry, for businesses, and for themselves. But also having access to open infrastructure is also very, very important. But we run a lot of events around things like that. We run workshops and events. Next event is on 27th of March if anyone's over in Manchester. So we're looking at actually land use and who owns land, which is a quite contentious issue at the moment. So looking at land registry data, if anyone's interested in that. But we also work on new initiatives that look at new data practice. We work with data standards. 360 giving is one of those standards. Open contracting data standard. I mean, these are all kind of basically for the release of open data. But we're very interested in the Internet of Things. So a couple of things that I want to talk to you about with regards to that and what we're doing. We're very interested in the idea of data, very interested in data ethics and the proper use of data, especially when it's collected through sensor environments. And we've recently been, back in November, we were commissioned to do a piece of work that we've been developing, which was looking at the impact of sensors within the public environment. The Noble Building Framework is what we called it, was quite a contained project. And it was looking at how we can install sensors within older buildings that would provide benefits to the landlords because they'll be able to understand how their buildings perform. And generally, with Internet of Things and sensor systems, these tend to be fitted into new buildings, part of the specifications of new builds, and you don't really get that with older buildings. But primarily, it was to do with about how do you create a consensual approach to actually putting sensors in an environment where you might get mixed use, public, workers, operatives and owners, etc. And what are the underlying ethical issues with regards to that? So there's a number of different reasons why we went for this. So the building where we've placed the sensor network. And so one of the great things about Things Network, it allowed us to readily place and fit sensors in a non-invasive way into a building, into a built environment. I mean, we put up one of the gateways, as Patrick's mentioned, which is basically connects the sensors to the internet. And it was able to, the sensors that we put in the building were also able to connect to the constellation of Things Manchester gateways that exist in the city centre. The building is a mixed-use building. It's got a mixture of co-working, it's got public space, and it's got discrete office units as well. So what we were doing was trying to test how sensors are implemented and how sensors are received across a wide range of stakeholders and in a wide range of scenarios. So what we found particularly interesting about sensors is we generally don't understand sensors within our environment. By their very nature, sensors are nondescript. You wouldn't recognise one. Is it a fire alarm? Is it a smoke detector? Is it what are these? What Wi-Fi router? What are these things? And this makes the implementation of, or trying to get consent with implementation of sensors quite challenging, because we talk about sensors as being quite abstract. It's not as if it's like in a science fiction film where you've got a digital readout and it goes bleep and has got a big sign all over it, as you would see in Blade Runner or something. These things are nondescript, and they're meant to be nondescript. So that creates its own kind of issues within that. So we placed around about 35 sensors within this building, which obviously allowed us to monitor the building performance over time. So here we see this kind of periodic kind of this is humidity. The humidity rising, the humidity falling, rising, falling, rising and falling. And we could compare that with humidity levels in the outside environment as well. So we could actually see that obviously when there was a few weeks ago when there was heavy rain, we started to see the internal humidity of the building rise up, which is incredibly useful if you've got an older building, because you never know whether the humidity is coming from the occupants within the place. As I say, there's a cafe within there. Are they not ventilating the room properly, or is it something to do with maybe a leak? What can we infer from this data? So within this also, one of the rationales for actually implementing the network with the landlords was that we basically said we can save you loads of money. We can save you around about £20,000 a year, which makes quite a compelling business case. I'm not too sure whether we can or not. I mean, we just said that. But the idea is they just kind of leave their heating on. So what we were able to say is that, well, as you can see during the day, you get these periodic modulations, and you can see that in different parts you get different latencies and time lags, and heating stays on for longer than sometimes, and switches off quicker on other times. And so you can start to create a story, create a narrative about the building. And especially when you start talking about, when you start talking about saving money in buildings, because this period here is actually a weekend. So there's this building isn't occupied. Why is this modulation still happening during the weekend? It does not need to happen. So there is one kind of potential cost saving within this. There are sometimes uses of the building over the weekend, but these tend not to be that often. Also, what we started to notice was the modulations weren't actually dipping off as much as we would expect in the evening. So the heating, people generally leave the office by 6. They all have to be out by 7. But the thermal lag within the building takes a long time, or some of the heating systems don't switch off in time. Within the building, there's 4 different heating systems, which makes the whole thing very complicated. It's got gas-fired central heating, it's got HVAC, it's got electrical heaters, and it's also got some other kind of heating system as well. So it's very hard to control these systems. But you tend to find that all old buildings will have a hodgepodge of systems within them. So we've kind of played it back to them and said, look, this is potentially where you could save a lot of money. And if you've got it is actually a 9-floor building if you count the 2 basement floors, there are potential money savings to be made. So that was the business case. But what we were interested in is what else the actual the system started to show. So this was what we started to see these blips all over the building, and we couldn't work out what these were. And so these blips happened generally in the morning. So 7:15, this is a humidity blip. 7:15 and finishes around about 8:15. The usage during the day means that the humidity starts going up. Does anybody have any idea what this humidity blip might be? No? What? Right. It is. And so basically what you could do with using some of the movement sensors, you start to realise, well, actually you can start to track different types of activities within the building. So that is actually mopping of the floor in one area, and this is replicated throughout the building. And so what is just seen to be quite an innocuous and neutral measurement of humidity in a building, you could start to see that if it was abused, it could actually be used as a means of surveillance. And so there are certain issues that you need to actually start thinking about when you start to look at certain kind of neutral types of devices. And this is all part and parcel of what we were trying to explore. And one of the other things we started to notice when we're kind of doing an audit of the systems within the building was the prevalence of detectors and sensors that no one really knew about, or no one really had any control over, or nobody really knew why they were there. When there was Wi-Fi routers, but these are also able to track you throughout the building. And when you start thinking about, well, we've just created a dumb sensor network, when you start really realizing that sensor network may be able to be tied together with identifiable data, you start running into certain issues. And within legislation, new legislation, GDPR, I'm an expert here, you might tell me if I'm right or wrong. If any component of data which can be made to be can be matched with personally identifiable information, then you need to start thinking about what's the data protection laws with regards to that. So anyway, we looked around. There's lots of different sensors, things that just kind of had basically detected your Bluetooth on your phone, things that detected your MAC address. They all existed. Smart light bulbs, smart this and that, smart kettles. One of the things we were very interested in when we were doing the work was the fact that lifts generally will have 20, well, this particular lift has 27 sensors, which it sends that data back to the maintenance centre, which is in Switzerland. So you can imagine within that environment, there's a possibility of weighing individuals depending on what time they use the lift. So it's quite interesting how you've got all these connected technologies, and if you kind of pulled them all together, you could reveal quite perhaps a scary story. But these systems aren't joined together, so they're not generally being abused. So this is the things that we're looking at with this. So it's kind of charting kind of all the different types of sensors, what they do, the domains that they work in, the power relationships of the individuals within the building. So it's quite a complex ethical kind of project, really, ethical kind of mapping. And hopefully we're actually going to work out a way that you can actually, with some confidence, work out how to implement a sensor-based system to fairly high ethical standards. Another project that we're doing, or was hoping to start off, which is also using the Things Network, is to do with pollution in Greater Manchester. A colleague of mine mapped pollution levels to school locations using what was called EarthSense data released by the BBC. And we found there were a number of schools within Greater Manchester that actually had the highest levels of pollution. And this was an issue. And within Greater Manchester, like most places, air pollution is very high on the political agenda. So this project is bringing together a number of stakeholders: Groundwork Trust, Co-op Foundation, Democratic Society, and a number of other stakeholders to try and map out how we can build sensor networks on the Things Network, where schools can actually start to understand the pollution that happens. Is it just pollution that's at 9 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or is it something that's more of a kind of flat trend? Working with school children and starting to create activities with school children so they can understand data in the environment and perhaps affect change through the information that they manage to understand and feed that back to their parents, especially if they drive. And also use that as a way of representing back to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority about the nature of pollution. But more importantly, working with Groundwork Trust, who have developed a range of mitigations with regards to green planting, because obviously schools can't move from a motorway, but you can actually mop up pollution with evergreen hedges and staggered with deciduous trees. The ways that you can, through planting, you can mitigate some of the pollution impacts within schools. So as I say, this is something that we're kind of starting up with. We're working with Groundwork at the moment, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without the Things Network. We wouldn't have even been able to think about it without the Things Network. So thank you.
Thank you.